We're beginning Section 3 of Chapter 3, A Simple Coup d'etat to a Global Mechanism. Of the Secret Team, the CIA and its allies in control of the United States and the world, by Colonel Fletcher Prouty. For nothing is hid that shall not be made manifest, for anything secret that shall not be known and come to light. Take heed then how you hear. Luke chapter 8, verse 17 through 18, a modern parable. The jet airliner had just left the runway with the ex-president of Gandia aboard and was winging its way high over the snow-clad Andes. In less than 2 hours, it would land in the capital of Peguan, where the ex-president had been assured of asylum and safety. In a remote office in Washington, the watch officer awaited and expected word from the agent who arranged this flight, confirming that the departure had taken place. It was too soon to expect the collateral news that General Alfredo Eliciado Ileona had secured the reins of the government of Gandia. This news he would get as soon as a second agent arrived in the capital with the new president. Desk officers had working all night preparing releases for the news media and sending instructions to its operatives, readying them to support General Eliciado's new government. In distant Gandia, all was quiet in spite of the sudden coup d'etat. It may have been the quiet before the storm. For the time being, all had gone well. In the cabin, an old converted transport C-47 DC-3, General Eliciado was sleeping off the effects of a heavy drinking bout on an Army-style cot that had been fitted into his modest VIP airplane. As soon as the plane had landed on its return from the frontier outpost, the pilot had parked it behind the U.S. Air Force surplus World War II hangar. The general and his closest friends had not even left the plane. Their party had continued on through the night in the plane. The pilot and friend of the general, a U.S. Air Force major, had sent the others home while he stayed until the general had slept it off. As he tidied up the plane, he recalled similar days in Greece and Iran, where he had worked as a mission commander on other exercises for Acme Plumbing. Here's a footnote. One of the most frequent and unclassified code names for the CIA in general conversation by employees and those familiar with their intimate jargon. Note how the White House Watergate Affair group called themselves the Plumbers, shows their CIA lineage. But this was the first time that he himself had been the key agent in the making of a president. It had been hard work, and now all he could do was wait for the brilliant mountain sunrise and word from the embassy that all was well and that the city was under control. In a few hours, the general would be awakened and prepared to enter the capital as the new president. Now, as he lay there on that crude cot, he did not even know that the coup d'etat had already been taken place and had already been completely successful. The major had been in Gandia for slightly more than 1 year. He had come to join the U.S. Air Force mission there after 6 months of accelerated training at Elgin Air Force Base in Florida. He had flown little since his duty in Korea, but it had all come back quickly with the intensive program the CIA had scheduled for him there. At Elgin, he had learned new paradrop techniques and had worked closely with the newly formed Special Air Warfare Squadrons. One squadron had been sent to South Vietnam, another had gone to Europe, and the one he was to join had flown to Panama. There he had received further operational training exercises with the U.S. Army Special Forces troops in Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. Other operations had taken him on an earthquake mercy mission to Peru and a medical team paradrop exercise into a mining town in Bolivia. It was while he was in Bolivia in the Western Hemisphere Division had contacted him through the embassy and not told him to report to Gandia. Not long after he arrived in Gandia, he met General Eliciado. The general had been working with a specially equipped transport plane doing paradrop work over the mountain forests of the eastern frontier. The general was from a leading family in Guyana and would trace his ancestry back to the days of Simon Bolivar. Yet he was proud of the fact that he was Gandian and made slight reference to his Castilian ancestry. He loved the squat, barrel-chested mountain people. He was one of them. He was a man of the people, and he was the most famous flyer in the country. He had flown serum to stricken villages during an epidemic, and he had airdropped tons of relief supplies after an earthquake. The people of the villages loved the general, even though he was not a favorite in the capital. As in Latin American countries, the government was centered in the capital. What took place in the capital was important. What took place in the villages could be ignored. When the general was made the chief of staff of the Ghanaian Air Force, the old president thought he had made a safe assignment. The general was part of no clique in the city, and he was no threat to anyone. From the first, the general and the U.S. major got along fine. The major preferred the men of the villages to those in the capital, and in no time at all he was popular. Wherever he went, the general, too, was popular. In this remote site, the major had become the friend of everyone in the village and in the Ghanaian Air Force unit. The general had noticed that the units the major worked with always seemed to be able to get supplies and favors, which had been hard to get before from military aid channels. The major must have had some special influence with Washington. On the other hand, whenever the major distributed these hard-to-get items, always credited the general with getting them. This magic was simply a part of the long reach of the secret team. The major was on a CIA cover assignment, and although everything he did had the appearance of normal U.S. Air Force duty, he was in Gandia to gather intelligence. He was part of a very normal inside operation. He knew who was on General Elisiaro's team, and he knew who was not. He knew which elements of the government worked with the Air Force and which were aloof or antagonistic. When his routine reports, which he filed daily through his contact in the embassy and not through the Air Force channels, revealed that he was getting quite close to the general, they were passed on by the Deputy Director of Intelligence to the Deputy Director of Plans, and thence to Western Hemisphere. From that date on, Western Hemisphere monitored all traffic to and from the major, and from time to time would feed him special instructions and other data. Western Hemisphere wanted to know exactly whom the general trusted and who in the government he worked with on official matters. In Gandia, as in many other countries, this could mean who does he share his cut of the government funds with, and who shares theirs with him? One day, General Elisiaro told the major of his growing displeasure with the government of the old president. This was passed on to the Western Hemisphere Division. Day by day, the major increased the scope of and coverage of the civic action training exercises that the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Army Special Forces troops were interested in, and that gave special credit to General Elisiaro. He was seen everywhere with new projects to build rural schools. He was seen delivering water pipe to a remote village from an Air Force transport. His fighters roared over distant cities and towns, letting the people know that the Air Force was everywhere. General Elisiaro opened the new U.S. satellite tracking station, and he was at the dedication ceremony of a new U.S. mining company's mountain airfield. And everywhere the general went, the major was somewhere in the background. The major found ways to be helpful to the general, and he gave the general an opportunity to widen the gap between himself and his government. Before long, the general was led to believe that the U.S. government also was displeased with the old president. Although nothing was ever said, General Elisiaro was quite certain that if he made a move to take over the government, the U.S. government would not make a move to support the present regime. Note the formula. There was no commitment of any kind to support a coup d'etat. On the contrary, the formula calls only for tact agreement, not to support the incumbent. As a matter of fact, the Major had been sent to Gandia to look out for subversive insurgency. The possibility of a coup had been developed quite spontaneously, and once it became a possibility, it was nurtured. As soon as the general realized this, he began to see himself as a person in power. The lure was undeniable. He began to create his own team, and he began to count his chances. It was not long before he came to the Major with the outline of a well-planned scheme that purported to see a real and immediate requirement for a big civic action exercise in a remote province. This exercise would require special consignment of weapons, ammunition, and perhaps silver bullion to buy off some of the dissident tribesmen. General Elisiado made a good case for his plan and assured the Major that the natives would be properly stirred up at the right time to make it seem to everyone that this exercise was not only the real thing for training purposes, but that a government show of force in that area would help put down rampant communist-inspired subversion in the area. The only problem would be the weapons. The general had no way to get that much material without arousing suspicion. The incumbent government kept all munitions under close control in secured magazines. Otherwise, not a word was said about even the remote possibility of a coup d'etat. But both men, the U.S. Major and the ambitious general, understood each other. That night, the message from the embassy to Western Hemisphere Division were highly classified and loaded with instructions to include the requests for munitions and airlift. Western Hemisphere was quick to respond. The neighboring country, Pagon, had been scheduled to receive a normal large shipment of military assistance munitions. The CIA arranged to have these delivered ahead of schedule and to see the order with extra items for General Elisiado. The U.S. Air Force was directed to make available 4 medium transport aircraft for the Gandian Air Force's civic action training exercise. When all was in readiness, 2 large C-130 heavy 4-engine transport planes took off from Panama, bound for Begon. However, they filed a devious flight plan in order to make some upper altitude weather tests for NASA. This gave them extra time en route. They landed in Pagon on schedule, but unknown to that government, they had touched down on a remote mountain strip long enough to dump off a number of pallets loaded with munitions for Gandia. The 2 C-130s were able to get back in the air with only a 30-minute delay and to make their scheduled arrival time at their original destination. No one knew they had delivered this cache of arms for the rebels in Gandia. At the barren airstrip, there had been only 4 men, all from the United States Air Force. They had arrived unnoticed and unannounced in one of the U.S. Air Force Special Air Warfare U-10 Helio light aircraft. This rugged light plane was especially designed to land in short distances in rough terrain, yet it could carry 6 men or 4 men, a cargo of special equipment. These men had set up panel signals to show the C-130s where to land. Then they had driven a number of heavy crowbars into the ground. To each one, they affixed the loop end of a long nylon rope with a hook at the end. As soon as the first C-130 landed, they directed it to turn around and open its huge rear-end cargo doors. The lines were passed into the crew and attached to pallets on which ammunition was firmly strapped. Then C-130 gunned its engines for takeoff. The ropes pulled each pallet out, and the ropes pulled each pallet out of the plane and left a string of cargo on one side of the clearing. The process was repeated with the other C-130 on the other side of the clearing. No sooner had the C-130 left than 4 smaller C-123 medium transports arrived from Gandia, flying low over the mountain ridges to escape detection. The first plane landed short and spun around ready for takeoff. It carried a small forklift unit that was used to load all 4 planes. The whole operation had taken less than an hour, and just before the 4 men left in their helio, one of them drove the forklift over the cliff at the edge of the runway. The C-123 hedge hopped to the remote area in preparation for the Civic Action exercise. Civic Action I did it again. Civic Action exercise. My God. Can't even speak English. 2 U.S. Army Special Forces advisors working with the tribes in the exercise area. Hey. Okay. 2 U.S. Army Special Air Force advisors working with the tribes in the exercise area staged a pre-dawn attack using fire flight packages, along with a team of Gandian Special Air Forces, who were told that they were on a training exercise.